I don't think he can last that long, bearing in mind the state in which he has put Russia. He's bequeathing it an awful legacy, both morally but also financially, because he is impoverishing Russia with this war. When 40% of the federal budget is spent on defense, and so much of the government's time and effort is going into the prosecution of its war, then I don't think he can sustain it for another 12 years.
Now, though, on Times Radio, the election station. Stop this.
Election 2024.
Russia. Yes, Russia's Central Electoral Commission has confirmed Vladimir Putin has won a fifth term as president, cementing his rule for another 6 years. To a large extent, the outcome was never in doubt, with all opposition stifled in the election. Well, the former Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, spoke to Times Radio Breakfast this morning about the election's implications for the West.
On our east of the European continent of Europe, we have a very aggressive power led by the same man, a former KGB officer, who has effectively launched attacks against the West and our values even before the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So I think it means more insecurity, more instability.
That's Ben Wallace there speaking to Breakfast this morning. Let's turn now to James Nixey, Russia director at the defence think tank Chatham House. James, 87% of the votes won, in inverted commas, by Vladimir Putin. What does that percentage tell us? How does it compare to previous elections that he's won?
Yeah, good morning. And it compares favourably. In the last election, he got something in the late 70s. Now he's got something in the late 80s. When you said earlier, the extent was to a great extent predetermined. It was to a full extent predetermined. They had to, in fact, they looked at a figure that they wanted. I mean, it doesn't really matter precisely what that figure is, 87, 88%. And of course, elections in Russia are not, they're not to discover the will of the people or to obey the will of the people. They're to validate the decisions of the rulers. So that is precisely what this farce, this piece of performance theatre was all about. It was a referendum on the war with no choice about it.
So, to what extent is this 87%? Is it actually the case that of the ballot papers put in ballot boxes, 87% voted for him? Or is this number, can we even trust that number? Is it just plucked out of thin air?
You can't trust the number even remotely, because of the two types of voting, both in person, on a ballot box, in a piece of paper in a ballot box, and electronic voting, which we've also wheeled out this time. Obviously, electronic voting is open to recoding and manipulation electronically, and ballot box voting can be repurposed in the sense of you can destroy ballot papers, you can stack ballot papers, and that is exactly what has been seen to be done, even on the TV cameras, which are seen in polling stations in Russia.
So what does this tell us then about Putin's position, his personal confidence, if he needs this sham idea of 87% and a so-called record turnout of 77.5%? How confident is he in his own position and in the war that he's fighting against Ukraine?
I think that's a really good question, because you would imagine in a dictatorship like Russia, an authoritarian power like Russia, that there would be no need for this sort of self-affirmation, this confidence-boosting exercise where he can tell himself that he has 87% of the vote. And yet at the same time, he does seem to be particularly sensitive. I suppose elections are vulnerable times for even autocracies, where you have elections are when you trigger color revolutions. He survived a coup in June of last year by the late Yevgeny Prigozhin. It's what was done even in the Soviet Union. They held fake elections. They got 99% of the vote. North Korea has them as well. Again, so I think they are done because they've been done before, and because they need to show to the people that this war is popular and right from a Russian point of view.
And there was talk, there were these protests, the noon against Putin, where people were encouraged to go to polling stations at noon as a demonstration of their opposition to the sort of the rubber stamping of Putin. How significant overall were those protests, and should Putin be worried about their scale?
I think he is worried about them. That is why one presumes that Alexei Navalny was killed just before the election, so he could not engender any further protest, anything more, by being alive. Obviously, there's a martyrdom aspect to him being dead, and it was allegedly his last wish that there would be this protest at noon vote in Russia. But the numbers are not enormous in terms of the population of Russia. But that said, they numbered in the several thousands across Russia. And it was thought to be the safest way of doing it. You can't very well arrest people for turning up to vote, even in a dictatorship. That would be even more perverse than it already is. So, but the reality is that there is no meaningful, non-systemic opposition to the ruling government party in Russia.
And just finally, then, he's 71, Vladimir Putin. Another 6 years takes him, what, 77? Young by American standards, of course. Can he go on and on and on? Is there any sort of succession planning, any sense of what Russia might look like after Putin?
Yeah, you're right on the figures. 71 takes him to 77. Then he's allowed to stand for another 6-year constitutionally mandated term after that. That takes him up to 83. That's older than Biden is now, but not as old as he would be if he finished a second term. For what it's worth, I don't think he can last that long, bearing in mind the state in which he has put Russia. He's bequeathing it an awful legacy, both morally but also financially, because he is impoverishing Russia with this war. When 40% of the federal budget is spent on defense, and so much of the government's time and effort is going into the prosecution of its war, then I don't think he can sustain it for another 12 years. So we shouldn't worry that much. That said, what comes after Putin is not necessarily, of course, a great deal better. Although I would argue that perhaps a successor may not have quite the same sociopathic, ultra-nationalistic leanings, to the same extent anyway.
It's fascinating to see what happens. James, thanks very much for that. It's James Nixey, Russia director at the defence think tank Chatham House, and plenty more analysis, of course, on the situation in Russia online at thetimes.co.uk and on the Times Radio YouTube channel. Lots of discussion about both the politics of Russia, but also the way the war in Ukraine is panning out.